Hello everyone, I'm Sisanda Njinga and welcome to On the Couch. So today on the couch, I'll be chatting to Richard Loat, who is the founder of several social enterprises, one of which being Five Whole for Food. Richard has since become an advisor to social entrepreneurs, and he'll be talking to us a little bit about impact entrepreneurship and some of the things that you should be looking out for as a social entrepreneur. Richard, how are you this morning?
I'm doing fantastic. It's really good to be speaking with you today.
It's so good to see you. It's been a minute. It's just really good to see your face.
It's great. It's great that we can stay connected, despite being on different sides of the world. But here we are. We're finding ways to make change despite the pandemic.
So Richard, can you tell me, I know in my intro I said that you are a founder of several social enterprises and you've been in this game for quite a bit now, and you've kind of pivoted from being a social entrepreneur yourself to actually now advising impact entrepreneurs. Can you tell us a little bit about your journey and your background and how you got into the impact entrepreneurship space?
Yeah, absolutely. In 2010, off the back of the Vancouver Olympics, I was based in Canada at the time. I saw an opportunity to take a passion of mine, which was hockey, and a real gap, which was lack of support for food banks in Canada. And so I built an organization called Five Whole for Food. We had a sport-based model that was supporting food banks across the country and really built a movement amongst young, change-interested people to support and tackle food security issues in Canada. That actually subsequently led to interest from the British government and a few other countries, and we built sister organizations, sister social enterprises in the UK, across Europe, and we did some work in South America. The idea being that sport could be this incredibly powerful vehicle for change, mobilizing people, but also creating kind of a long-term affiliation to change. And from there, I've gone on to work with a number of investors and funds that are supporting change makers, particularly with an interest in looking at early stage organizations and how they need a very different sort of support and how they can really, leverage what they have, scarce resources, scarce funds, and also they're like sponges, they're learning so much. So how can you support them to really grow and tackle the issues that they're tackling? So I moved into an advisory role, a mentorship role for young change makers because I could go on to create other organizations myself, but equally there are so many other people creating change out there. So how do we invest in them and elevate them up?
So I know that recently, I think over the past couple of years, there've been a lot more people getting into the space of impact entrepreneurship, right? Why do you think that is? And what do you think some of the misconceptions are about being an entrepreneur? Because I think a lot of people think it's really flashy. They see people, on the news and doing really well. So a lot of people have kind of gotten into that space. Why do you think that's happening more and more now?
There's a lot of reasons. I think one of the biggest reasons is probably systemically the way our societies are structured. There are a lot of people that feel like they don't fit. There are a lot of issues that are being missed. There are gaps in the way that society takes care of itself now more so than ever in the past. And I think that's a significant factor. I think the other thing is there are the ability to make change is at our fingertips now more so than ever before. The ability to kind of crowdsource interest, crowdsource funding, the ability to mobilize your peers and create change of different scale. When I got into this, I gave a talk and I said I want to create Charity 2.0. At the time, we were thinking in the terms of charity. And the idea was very much that, charity then was about writing a check. Change making was about giving money. But I think now the ways that we can create change come from elevating certain voices, from different creative forms of change, from actually not necessarily changing something, but actually redesigning entire processes and the way in which we handle things. So I think it's a combination of people feeling like they don't necessarily connect or fit with the current world around them, and two, the fact that we all want to make change, and it's more accessible than it's ever been before.
And what would you say are some of the misconceptions? Because I feel like a lot of people think entrepreneurship is easy. They think that you wake up today, you start a business, and by next year you'll be making money and you'll be rich and you'll be, making real change. So what are some of the misconceptions that you've kind of realized within the space?
There's a few of them that I kind of see no matter where you are in the world. One of them is that a lot of times I think people want to make change, but it ends up being a vanity project. It's not something that they're able to fully commit to. And I think that the number one thing is whatever you're going into, the hustle won't stop. You'll never get to a point where the job is done, right? And it's really, it requires a long-term commitment and a passion that sometimes people they aren't prepared for it. They may be very passionate about something, but they're not ready for the long-term grind that's required. I think the other thing, the other misconception that's out there is that, or maybe it's not a misconception, but something people aren't prepared for is that, just because you have an idea and you have an intent to do well, so much needs to underpin that. Social entrepreneurs. The notion of an entrepreneur running a business, you need a business model, you need a structure, you need an approach to the way you're going to do what you're going to do. I think sometimes people can get stuck with, idea, cause, and they haven't quite linked the two, right? And I think what the misconception is that if I have an idea and I want to make a difference, I can go do it. Yes, you can. The world is your oyster. But, you also have to get the right people around you. And there's some really key steps that need to go in the middle to make that vision a reality.
So what would you say are some of the things that people should be considering before they go off and say, hey, I want to change the world and I see this issue and I see this problem and I want to change it? What should they be thinking about before starting a movement? What should be the, let's say, top 3 things that they should, really put some thought into before they start?
So finances is something that's going to come up everywhere. How do you finance your project? But actually, more importantly, how do you finance yourself, right? It's easy when you've got a full-time job and you can pay the bills. But if you want to start this passion project, you can't just quit your job. All of a sudden, you run out of cash flow and you're trying to build something which also needs an investment of potentially capital or otherwise. And so I think really carefully considering what's your step, So I've met some change makers recently that are trying to move from full-time corporate employment into running their own social enterprise. And, for example, they're working on, okay, how do I go down to 50% a week so that I can still cover my costs but also have the time to invest in, building my idea. And eventually you hopefully want to get to a point that you draw, your income from one end draws down as the other end draws up. And then you can successfully and sustainably kind of transition into investing into this passion project full time. I think the other thing to think about too is, when you're building movements, social entrepreneurship ideas, social change, for consumers of social enterprise products, I think the idea of change is very much a lifestyle choice, right? Why am I choosing to buy this socially responsible good, whatever that is? And so when you're building something that's going to plug into someone's lifestyle, you've got to think about how you engage with those people in a long-term fashion. It's not just about being a flash in the pan. Someone hears about you today and you've got them forever. Social change as a lifestyle choice is also about a journey and remaining connected to your audience. And I think oftentimes you've got great ideas that turn into great products, but there's a disconnect with who you're trying to reach with those products, whether it's the people you're trying to help, the beneficiaries, so to speak, as well as the people that you want to buy your product or to engage with your social enterprise. And so, fundamentally, any organization, business, charity, whatever you start, it relies at its core on relationships, and your customer is a relationship that can balloon. You might have hundreds of thousands of customers, but there's still ways to make sure that relationship with them is slight. There's an intimacy there, right? And that's what I've spent a lot of time trying to perfect and change. And it's different in different parts of the world with different ideas. But at the end of the day, people are what make this happen. And if you lose sight of that, oftentimes that's the first hole you fall into, and it's difficult to get out of.
So like, while hearing you speaking about the beneficiaries of the people that you're trying to help, it's often said that the people closest to the problem are always the best that should be fixing the problem itself, right? So, or if you're helping solve a problem, you should also be including the people that are closest to the problem, right? But how feasible is it, considering like lack of resources, especially like in underserved communities? So if I'm here and I'm saying there is this issue in my community and I really want to change it, is it really possible for me to make that change by myself, considering that there aren't necessarily the resources I need to make that change within my community?
But one of the things I've learned in the last few years is that your change project doesn't have to become enormous to create sustainable change. I think very often when we go out there and we have ideas and we want to create social enterprises that make a difference, sometimes the scale with which we're shooting for doesn't actually meet the scale of the problem, so to speak. And sometimes a smaller, more sustainable, community invested approach can not only help the people you intend, but also be sustainable in the long run. So I'll give you an example. Everyone got really into those red iPhones, Project Red, as a social change label or branding, if you want to call it that. And that's become global. It's on iPhones, for goodness sake, right? But if that's what we're all shooting for, when we have an idea and we think, okay, I've got this idea, I want to make a difference, but that's where I want to go. That's not realistic for every idea. I think the other thing that's important to remember is, some projects might be impacting people, some might be impacting causes. If we're looking at climate change and things like that, and it's just so important to have the people you're helping involved in not only designing, the process, but also in the change, because ultimately there's an authenticity which will allow the people that support you to support you even more. And I just think that we've moved on in our change making journey from parachuting into areas and deciding, hey, this is what I want to help you, so I'm just going to tell you what to do. We've evolved from that, right? We're at another level, and I think sustainability is this buzzword that's thrown around, but at the end of the day, it's how does this live beyond me? Because if I get hit by a bus tomorrow and these people can't continue to support themselves with what I've started, what change have I really made? They're back to square one, right? And so that's, for me, I think, the big thing.
But like, I think with social entrepreneurs specifically, it's very hard to separate yourself from the problem that you're trying to solve. You become very much like intertwined in it, and you kind of it's you and it become one. How, as somebody who is an entrepreneur, right, sitting at home, who is watching this thinking, that's who I am, this is my baby, this is my everything, what would you say to them to help them kind of separate themselves from the problem and realize that you and the problem are two completely different things? And why is it important for you to separate yourself from the problem?
Yeah, it's a good point. I think particularly a lot of social entrepreneurs' ideas are solving problems that they've experienced themselves, and it can be difficult to separate yourself from the problem. I think at the end of the day, though, in order to truly address that problem and scale this idea, people have to realize that the problem is part of their origin story. You know, in some ways, you know, every superhero, every Marvel character has an origin story. The fact that that's part of your origin story is it's very important because that's going to drive you. That's going to give you credibility and legitimacy in the work that you continue to do. But unless you're able to remove yourself from the problem itself, it can start to encumber you, right? And it can start to hold you back. And I think it's an important part of selling you, the founder, you, the change maker. But it's not necessarily critical to selling whatever your idea or product or solution is. And so fundamentally, you know, they say don't lose sight of where you've come from. It will always be an important part of the journey and the brand that's developed. But at some point, you know, separating yourself from that and understanding how it plugs into the bigger picture will allow any change maker to make some really systemic change, you know, that goes beyond their backyard and their immediate surroundings.
I like that you touched on scaling, right? I think we find ourselves in a very, very tricky situation with lockdown. Like it's very tricky, especially for entrepreneurs. But at the same time, a lot of entrepreneurs want to ensure that their businesses are still either growing or are still here after this period that we find ourselves in. What advice do you have for a business owner who is just trying to survive right now, who's just trying to survive this period that we're in?
Gosh, it's that really is the $1 million question. Everyone is in some pretty tricky times. I think survival looking forward is really about consolidating. So it's very easy when you're a social entrepreneur, especially if you're bootstrapping. If you're bootstrapping, you know, you've got all these different ideas. You're trying to growth hack your way to all sorts of different outcomes. And I think now's the time to really take stock and double down on what you're good at. You know, engage and retain your core that is going to get you through the next 6 months, or maybe longer, depending where people are in the world. But going back to what you're good at, you know, cutting any kind of special projects, things that might be things that might be incurring a few extra costs and really get down to what's necessary right now. And I think by doing that, they'll buy themselves a bit more time. And it's also a time, I think, to reflect on what's gone well, and who is really there to, like, who are your key audience and constituents, you know? I think one thing that this whole situation has shown us is that despite all the, like, you know, the world is on fire, despite all of that stuff happening, people still care about people, you know, and we all have our causes, we all have our interests, we all have the people that we support, and we will continue to support them because we want to see them survive. You know, we want to see their ideas survive. And I think it's just about doubling down on those relationships, letting people know that, you know, you're there. Communication is key, a really strong and good approach to communication so that people understand what you're going to do, what you need, and your plan to get through this will you know, make things a little bit easier. I'm not going to sugarcoat it. It's a difficult time, you know, particularly for startups that are bootstrapping. I've unfortunately seen a few of them disappear. That's the way of the world. But for those that are able, consolidate to your core, engage with your core supporters, and just be transparent about how you plan to get through this so that they can support you on that journey.
Communication. Yeah. I think it's really hard. I think I've been talking to quite a number of entrepreneurs during this period, and I think that's been the hardest part, to just look at things for what they are and be honest with yourself. And sometimes having to just pivot and say, okay, this is where I am, and this is how I thought I was going to run this business. But because of what's happening now, I have to kind of change, how I do things. And I have to communicate to my audience and the people that I'm serving. I think a lot of people have had, it's been a big struggle. One of the main, I think the main issues that have come up over and over again with my conversations has been mental health. And I think for the first time, entrepreneurs are actually talking about the difficulties they're having during this time, because everybody else is also kind of talking about their mental health status right now. So it's also become easier for them to do so. What have you been doing during lockdown to make sure that you're like in an okay headspace?
Yeah. There was a period of time, I think, where we could only leave the house once a day over here. So it really was difficult. I think for me, mental health oftentimes is looked at in a really singular manner. I think physical health plays a big role in mental health, and that does, if you're not a runner, if you're not someone that's naturally into exercise. I'm not saying you have to go out there and run 5K a day, but for me, I used to run marathons. I used to be very fit and enjoy exercise, and I reached a stage where I just was kind of sick of it. But particularly during lockdown, I was getting out and walking. That activity plays such a big role in just setting yourself up to be in a good mental headspace. So that would be the first thing I'd suggest. I think a lot of times we don't stop to think who is in our immediate support circle. But I think, just stopping to think, okay, who are my key supports? Who can I go to? Is a second important step. And then I think the third thing is just being open and talking. I think oftentimes we're afraid, embarrassed. We don't want to admit when we're struggling. And being a social entrepreneur, it's really easy to burn the candle from both ends, to really burn yourself out. You've got the stresses of building something, keeping things afloat. You might have family stresses and other things. And I think it's okay to say, hey friend, I'm struggling juggling all the balls right now, and I need to talk to someone, right? And I think being open about the challenges, because now's not the time to pretend there isn't a pandemic and that everything's okay. If there's one time that it's okay to just be real, it's now. And I think it's actually just being able to admit this is difficult. It's very easy. I've heard so many people say, "This too shall pass." We will get to, there's a light at the end of the tunnel. All of that. Yes, that's true, but that doesn't make this any less difficult. It doesn't make this easy. It just means that we'll get there eventually. So I think I would just want to remind people it's okay to say this is hard. Tell that to someone and talk through what you're struggling with, because not only will there be a shoulder to lean on, but they might have a few ways that you can better handle things.
I hear you. I also think though that there have been some awesome things about lockdown, because we we have now been forced to kind of be still. For the first time, everybody has had to just stop and be still and look at things for what they are: the ugly, the good, the bad. So what have been some of the things that you've appreciated most about this period? Like, what have you been like, wow, I never realized that before, and this is just so great?
Oh man, I couldn't agree with you more. Oftentimes, yeah, everyone's looked at the bad. Oh, we can't travel. Oh, things have come to a grinding halt. Oh, I'm losing customers. Oh, I can't see my friends because I'm stuck at home in lockdown. don't get me wrong, it's a difficult time, but it's been I found it a really helpful time to kind of stop and recalibrate and really just refocus on what's important. I know that sounds a bit vague and cliche, but at the beginning of the year, I set out and I said, I want to achieve one, two, three, four things. But oftentimes, I won't even like revisit that list until 6 months on, or towards the end of the year. And it was just a really good opportunity for me to stop and say, okay, the entire landscape's changed. What do I want to focus on now, right? And I think the other thing is, when I say the landscape change, I also can't leave my house. That doesn't mean that I can't do anything. So how can I spend this time for me? And I think there was at the beginning there was this misconception that, oh, because we're all working from home and we all have this time, we have to be productive, right? And productivity is very much a conception from the pre-pandemic world. Now people have kids at home, their work hours are changing, what they're able to do is changing. Some people have lost their jobs, they're having to pivot their organizations. And so for me, I very much I valued being able to look at the things that were important to me. What are the projects I really want to focus on? What do they require? And I actually really appreciated the undivided time, to focus on things. It's very rare. I don't know when we'll next get such an extended period of time to focus. It's not been easy, but I've been able to do some research on new projects, which I've put off because I've needed, 8 hours at a go, for multiple days to really dive into a project. And so all's not lost. I can't work on the projects I was working on pre-lockdown, but I've had the chance to kind of work on some other ones. And I think there is very much a silver lining in this opportunity, because the world will go back, will come back online at some point, and we can then take everything we've done here and use it then.
What would you say is the most common thread amongst entrepreneurs during this time? You work with you advise a lot of different SEs. What would you say is the one thing that you've been realizing with all of them, that because I'm sure a lot of them have come to you to say, A, B, and C is happening in the business now. What do I do? Or A, B, and C is happening. This is how I feel. What have been some of the common threads within the SEs that you work with?
There's been probably two things that have been common across many of the SEs. I think one has been their newfound understanding at how much can be done digitally. So, whether that's from a human resource perspective, in terms of not having to be in the same place, or, moving to video calls and things like. So operationally, there's been this understanding that, wow, we can basically do what we were doing virtually. That's been huge. And the other, I think, has been this pandemic has forced already creative entrepreneurs to see things they couldn't see before, right? So products that people didn't know could be, tweaked slightly and turn into, online, e-commerce available, have all of a sudden emerged. People are reinventing their own products to reach the people that want them. And I think that's been one of the really exciting and refreshing changes that I've seen. And yeah, I think the second big thing that I've seen is just when you're a social entrepreneur, you're stuck in the hustle, like here, now, today. What do I do today to get me one step closer to sustainability, scale, more impact, new customer, whatever. Just because things kind of have stopped or paused for this period of time doesn't invalidate the idea. It does not stop what they were doing. But a lot of social entrepreneurs can get on a very linear track, particularly when they're sales driven. It's all about sales, right? And if their sales pipeline's disrupted, well, oh no, what do I do now? And I think the biggest thing that I've tried to reinforce for them is, okay, if your cash flow is reasonable or you're in a position to, you know, spend your time elsewhere, what are the other parts of the business that you can be building while maybe your sales are temporarily interrupted? Because the we're not going to live in lockdown forever, right? And so it's really what I've found they find most useful is supporting them to kind of readjust the way they spend their time so that they can move the business forward, even though they can't necessarily move sales forward.
And for you personally, what changes have you made during lockdown that you've appreciated, that have made you appreciate what you do even more? What are the things that you're just like, wow, I changed A, B, and C, and I'm gonna continue doing this after lockdown because it's made me actually fall in love with the work that I do even more than I really do.
You know what? I one of the change. It's a change. Maybe it's a return to something I used to do. But one of the things that lockdowns allowed me to do is go back to reading, and reading more like long form content. You know, there's lots of news articles and, you know, 10 ways to hack your life together, you know, these kinds of articles. But one of the things I found most useful is getting back to proper books that explore everything from how fine art influenced the developing of like the FBI training program to, you know, developing and exploring culture, to you know, understanding human evolution and how that impacts us. And the reason I bring that up is just, you know, I just find there's, particularly when you start reading about topics that aren't related to the core of work that you're doing, you learn a lot of transferable things. I think sometimes it's really easy. If I'm in environmental studies, I'm going to read about climate change and conservation, all these kind of similar ideas. But actually, by branching out into different themes or industries or topics, I've found the biggest takeaway is moving out of my domain of expertise to learn things that I can bring back into my domain of expertise.
Tell me, tell me, tell me. I want to know, what are you consuming? What are you reading? I'm like, what? What are you reading?
But it's everything from modern day geopolitics. I'm very keen on understanding the dynamics of the Middle East because I think they influence the rest of the world so much. There's a book called Visual Intelligence, which, as I mentioned, is about a woman who used to be fine art director at one of the major museums in the U.S. and how she's been recruited to train, you know, FBI agents and influence the FBI training program. I got very into a couple of books on human evolution, so Sapiens and Homo Deus are two excellent books that help you understand people better. So as a marketer and like someone that, you know, really looks at how digital can transform the way we engage with individuals, it sounds crazy, but the stuff that happened 6 million years ago when we were genetically programmed, there's a lot in us that is still the same way as it was 6 million years ago, right? And so I just understanding, I'm a student of how people work, you know, and how they interact and interface with each other. And so those have been some of the topics I've been reading about, because if you understand people, it changes what you can do, right? If you understand people, you learn how to sell. If you understand people, you learn how to tell a story. If you understand people, you learn how to build teams, you know, and so my reading is very often on a quest to understand how people work and how we can better connect and engage with each other.
But I must say, Richard, as much as people can be awesome, people can also be very challenging. And they can be very challenging. And but one of the things that I've kind of learned with just lockdown is that a lot more people are collaborating. There's a lot more collaboration within the entrepreneurship space. How has collaboration impacted your journey? Because I know, as somebody who works in different countries across the continent, you've had to collaborate with a lot of different people. How has that impacted your journey, and how important is collaboration for an entrepreneur?
I wouldn't have been able to do anything without collaborating. I mean, you look at some of the best entrepreneurs, social entrepreneurs, while there may be a single face of an organization, there's a really tight knit web of collaborations that elevate that person to be the face of an organization. So for me, I think back to starting Five Hole for Food, and while I was the face of what we did, I had a team of 40 people. We had a core of sponsors that we collaborated with. We were developing creative partnerships with different groups and organizations, and there's this saying like a rising tide lifts all boats, and I think that's very much the case. No one's ever going to turn you away for asking for help. And even more so, if you come up with an idea that helps them succeed at what they're doing, but also helps you, that's a win-win for everyone. So collaboration's a no-brainer for me. I think we help each other get to the top, and it's just fundamental to any sort of success.
Okay. I hear you. I hear you. But I know that a lot of people that kind of start out are very scared. They're often very scared to reach out, either because of what you had mentioned earlier, like being embarrassed, thinking that people will think you're stupid. Some will also go as far as saying, I don't want people to steal my idea. For you, how did you manage to be okay with putting yourself out there and getting criticism from people around you? How do you deal with criticism?
So it's really interesting. I've had to deal with like a lot of criticism from a young age. Like when I was young, I was a swimmer. I had Olympic aspirations, and I remember in school, kids would be like, "You're never going to make it to the Olympics, right?" And I said, "Well, I'm going to make it to the Olympics. Like that's what I want to do. I want to go to the Olympics." Now, I didn't make it to the Olympics, but I remember, I was also a swimmer. It wasn't a particularly popular sport. Kids made fun of me for being a swimmer, and for whatever reason, the community, the team around me, the rest of the swim team, were the reason I was able to kind of face that criticism, right? And I didn't select them. I joined the team, and they ended up becoming my closest friends. But it was that team and that support that enabled me to kind of stand up in the face of people that might have been trying to take me down and say, you know what, I can do this. And I tell you that story because when I started Five Hole for Food, my own mom said, Richard, I don't think you should do this. Maybe you should wait a bit longer and try it next year. My own mom, who's like my biggest fan and support. And I realized, then I had to bring one or two really key people to support me in building this vision. And when you have that buy-in and you commit to each other, it becomes easier to deflect the criticism. Now, obviously, selecting those people might be difficult if you don't have a natural co-founder or, you've come up with this idea yourself. But I find facing the criticism, facing the challenge becomes easier when you've got a core team that are there to back you and to validate your idea. And the other thing I'd say to people too is nobody ever came up with a new idea that everyone loved and supported. Because if everyone loved and supported and, was on board with that idea, someone would have already done it, right? It's very much a common thread through any sort of change maker that somewhere along the way, someone told them they couldn't do it or it wasn't possible. It wasn't too long ago that we didn't believe that, if you look at Tesla as a company, no one thought that electric cars and Tesla would make it. And now they're sending rockets into space, right? And I'm sure lots of, the public said that wasn't possible. So I think, when you look at any change maker's journey, what helps you get through the criticism, whether it's constructive or otherwise, is a small group that fundamentally believe in what's possible.
I love that you mentioned parents because I think, our parents are like they're our biggest supporters, but they're also our biggest critics, right? And I think those are the hardest people to convince when you're starting a social enterprise because I think parents never understand it. It's like you went to school, or either if you've gone to school, go to school and then go and work and bring income, especially for, I think entrepreneurs, especially from underserved communities, struggle a lot within within that space and trying to convince their parents that this is something that they need to do and this is something that's necessary. What advice do you have for those entrepreneurs who need to kind of convince their families that this is something that will ultimately, become something? Because I think in the beginning, because you're so invested in solving the problem, you often overlook the financials a little bit. So you do kind of tend to lean on family quite a bit for support. So how do you then, convince your parents and your family that this is something?
Yeah, it's difficult. I particularly came from a family where there was a strong cultural sense that you had to go to school, finish school, get a job, start climbing the ladder, and uh, it's not like it depends so much on where people are in the stage of their idea. But one of the things that I decided to do, because again, you need some sort of financial support, and if you lean too much on your family, it can lead to other problems. But at the beginning, I was saying you need this balance, of being able to support yourself and invest in your idea. And one of the things I'd strongly encourage people is to look at how much you can achieve by working on your project part-time, because that allows you to support yourself part-time, and you can make sufficient progress to get to the point that you attract some investment, or maybe you can hire someone else, or maybe you can hire yourself, right? But I think being realistic about balancing your income versus your expenditure / investment in this idea is really important. So in my experience, I freelanced while I was building 5 for Food. In fact, in the 5 years that we ran 5 for Food, I never once drew a penny from the organization. I managed to freelance and self-sustain myself through that so that I could invest in other people and growing what we were doing. So it was very much a conscious decision. Again, it's not easy. Not everyone's a freelancer, or maybe opportunities are different. But I think where possible, there's the assumption that I have to go full time into my project. And actually, if you go in 50%, you can get a lot done while also, finding a way to support yourself financially in the beginning phase. Yeah.
I hear you. I think a lot, because of where we are now, a lot of entrepreneurs are having to deal with the fact that either they continue with this or they just let it go, right? Honestly, because it's just getting tougher and tougher. So what would you say to somebody who's ready to throw in the towel right now, who's just like, what, actually, I don't know what the point of this is anymore?
It's gonna differ for every entrepreneur where they are in their journey. I think there's nothing wrong with saying now's not the right time. I don't think throwing in the towel means giving up and scuppering the idea. But I think it's also completely okay to say, look, the world is not in a place that's ready for this idea. Like I need investment or certain things, and I'm not ready to bring that idea up. And I've had that. There's a couple ideas that I had to sit on for 2 or 3 years before I decided to start playing with them. That time allows you to refine your idea. That time allows you to recruit other people, to do a bit more research. So I don't think it's a bad thing. For organizations that are maybe a little bit further along in their journey, they're already invested, they have investment, they might find themselves in a much more complicated situation. And to that end, without knowing any specifics, I'd just really urge them to reach out to their advisors, reach out to their mentors, and look at creative ways of getting through this. What I will say is, even if they throw in the towel, you cannot escape being an entrepreneur. Once you create your first idea, and even if it gets like the tiniest bit of traction, everywhere you go, everything you do, you're going to see problems and try to solve them. That's just the way it is. I tried to fight it actually at the beginning when I moved from 5 for Food onto other stuff. I was like, I don't want the hustle. I want to chill out. I don't, it's tiring. And yet I couldn't do it. And eventually I realized, like, it's boring without being able to, constantly ideate and come up with solutions and play with ideas. So, if you're worried that this is your one shot, it's not. The fact that you had the ability to come up with a solution to a problem means you'll probably come up with many more solutions. So, there's always tomorrow.
Oh, that's so awesome. Oh, you've made my soul smile now. Um and like in closing, like what is the one thing that you're looking most forward to when the world kind of gets back? I don't even want to say it gets back to what it used to be, because I don't think that's a thing anymore. When we get to when things are open again, what's the one thing that you're most looking forward to doing?
Uh, the one thing I'm most looking forward to doing, I'll give you a social entrepreneurship answer, because there's one thing I love doing with like the people I work with, and I just can't do it right now. But there's nothing more exciting than like locking five people in a room with pizzas and a couple of drinks and a whiteboard, and like just I like you throw ideas up there, you prototype, and you lock yourself away for 2 days, and 2 days later you come up with a new organization. With social distancing we can't do that, and things are complicated. But man, like the ideas you come up with in these like high combustion situations, that's where the magic happens. And I'm looking forward to doing that a bit more when we're allowed to, whenever that is.
Oh, Richard, thank you. Thank you so much for taking the time to have this chat with me. Um, you've actually inspired me now, and I'm like, actually that there's something that didn't work out, and I'm now thinking about it differently. Just by what you had said, of like sometimes you can sit on something and at another time look at it and it can actually work out. So thank you for that. And just thank you for being your awesome self.
No, it's my pleasure. I'm glad we could chat today. It was good to see you again.
It's so good seeing you. Enjoy Singapore.
Yes,
And hopefully when the borders are open again, we'll see each other soon.
I hope so. I can't wait to get back to that part of the world.